I have the pleasure today of introducing our keynote speaker for this morning's plenary, Dr. Lilian Pintea. Lilian and I go back, funnily enough, to SCGIS. We met at the 2004 conference. We became quick friends because we had a lot in common with our research. And we both found out that we lived in the Washington, D.C. area, so we kept in touch. And now we've been lucky enough to collaborate together on a few projects. So we were really thrilled when he said yes to our invitation to be the keynote speaker this morning. Lilian is a vice president of conservation science at the Jane Goodall Institute in Washington, D.C. And he holds a PhD from University of Minnesota in conservation biology and a master's from Moscow State University in Russia. He's also been a Fulbright scholar and a MacArthur scholar, and he has more than 25 years of experience using geospatial technology to help conserve chimpanzees and their habitats in Africa. So a lot of his experience revolves around bringing geospatial technology to local communities in Africa and employing mobile data collection and different kinds of geospatial technology to really help preserve wildlife and monitor their habitats. So today he's going to talk more about his work, and we welcome him here. Thanks so much, Lilian.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Janet. First of all, good morning to all of you. It's such a pleasure, and I'm so happy to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation to share with you a couple of lessons learned and experiences at the Jane Goodall Institute, how we have been trying to incorporate GIS with local communities and traditional knowledge to support our work. And by training, I'm a conservation biologist, and I've been using as Janet said, more than 25 years, different geospatial technology, from GIS or remote sensing to recently including more and more cloud and mobile. And but when we're looking at our needs at the Jane Goodall Institute, what I see is that we still have our major challenge is that chimpanzees, like many other biodiversity out there, is in crisis and facing extinction. Data and knowledge are a huge part of it. The gaps in data knowledge which we have in Africa are very real, and we need to do and leverage this technology in bridging some of these gaps. But what is clear to me as well, and is very frustrating, that a lot of existing data and knowledge and tools is just not incorporated into the decision making. Is not part of the dialogue or discussions, and is really, really difficult to develop and have wise decision making. We also see a reality that, on one hand, you have this enormous top-down solutions at the global scale, which is really important for us to, as a community, as a global community, to understand the crisis and try to address it. But there is a disconnect with the on-the-ground capacity and resources to actually implement that. There is this, again, disproportional investment in resources in developing the tools and technologies versus actually applying and building the capacity and using them on the ground. And just to wrap up, a lot of technologies which we all work with are not necessarily developed for conservation situations, as I'm talking, for example, in Africa, in disconnected environments and with all the challenges in terms of power and access to power and connectivity and tools. Anyway, so lots of challenges. But of course, as a technology person, and you probably share with me this feeling, it's incredible to look back at the last 20 years and not be excited about where we are in terms of how technology evolved, and what we can do now with this different tools and data. You probably have heard of this, that 90% of the world information and data was developed in the last 2 years. But I was surprised to realize that actually this is true for the last 30 years. Every 2 years we have been doubling, basically we're generating 10 times more data. And this is really interesting to me because if we're looking back at the 30 years of conservation and conservation decisions, I think we probably will agree that we're still in crisis and we still have to do much more. Well, so to me personally, I think it is clear that that explosion of big data and technologies didn't really materialize yet into this watershed moment where, a flow of wise decisions now is happening at different levels in order to benefit biodiversity and species. Well, Jane said it very well when basically she asked the question to us, how this is possible that here we are, we have this amazing brains and capacity to put a rover on a Mars and explore a distant planet, and at the same time we are destroying our own planet, which is the only one we got. Well, this takes me back to 1960s, and 2 days ago, actually it was quite an important day, on July 14th. Well, first of all, my daughter turned 7. Yes. Well, my mom turned 70, and this is in the same day we were lucky to share it together and celebrate. That's why I came quite late last night. But this is also the day where 50 years ago now, Jane stepped on the shores of Lake Tanganyika and started her pioneering research, which continues today at Gombe National Park in Tanzania. To kind of celebrate that and also to realize the importance of our close living relatives, July 14th this year was also announced as the World Chimpanzee Day. So here we go. A very important day. Not to mention Bastille and so on. But an important part of Jane's evolution as a conservation activist was when she took a small plane and flew over Gombe and realized that what was that wilderness and it was chimpanzees living in this amazing lush forest actually became this island of habitat surrounded by an ocean of humanity. And she was wondering how on earth, how it's possible for those chimps to survive in these situations. Jane Goodall also was one of the first visionaries out there in the conservation community who immediately realized back in the 1980s that it's not possible to save chimpanzees or any other biodiversity if the local communities are not benefiting, if they're not engaged, if they're not involved, if they're not became the stewards of this biodiversity. And otherwise, it's impossible to put all the biodiversity in protected areas. And I think we know, for example, that more than 70% of world biodiversity, I think, is in the hands of indigenous community, which only occupy less than 5% of the land territory. And I can tell you, for example, in Tanzania, 86% of chimpanzees live outside protected areas. They're on the local communities, lands, which in order to be, we have to work with communities in order to protect them. In 1994, Jane started with a group of Tanzanians Lake Tanganyika Catchment Reforestation and Education Project. And the entire idea was to engage these villages around Gombe National Park. And you can see that green area outside the park where the forest used to be back in the 1970s. And engage these communities to protect and restore this remaining forest. So the major tools were working and listening to the people what they need. And chimpanzees were not on the list. They wanted access to clean water, to medicine, to education, to more job opportunities. Around 2000, we start using GIS. And obviously that use of GIS was happening, it was building on this already relationships with the local communities, which has been done by the Takare project. And of course, going back all the way to 1960s, because one thing which Jane did when she arrived there was to hire local community, village representatives from different communities as our field researchers. And in 2001, we start getting high resolution imagery, which was just incredible because suddenly everyone could see and realize that Gombe is this island. This is a map from National Geographic, which was published in 2003. But because of the work with the communities and the way how our project was set up, we did much more than just using this imagery and classify it and analyze it. We brought it to the villagers and said, what do you see? You know, what is your perspective to what's happening on these landscapes? And here's a couple of examples from different villages back in 2003. And I often felt that it was more of a tool for us to learn and understand and appreciate local perspectives than for them to actually learn something about the environment. As a villager told me, we know every square meter of our land. Nevertheless, it was an important common language for us to use imagery mostly, and of course GIS in order to manipulate and manage and use the imagery. But it was an important opportunity for us to sit down for the first time and realize how much knowledge and wisdom and realize how different the values of local communities are in terms of using the natural resources. And for me as a conservation biologist, of course, I didn't know what to do with this information because for example, you can see here some woman showing where is her house. And these people never have seen maps or many of them don't know how to read. And they're able to look at the imagery, show the house, here's the footpath which I'm taking every morning, this is the field which I go and farm, this is a tree where I put my baby in the shade under this tree to sleep when I was farming. And this is where I go and collect the firewood, and this is where I go to go back home. So suddenly, you know, you realize all the places and all the ways how this different people are utilizing this land. We had experiences with local people talking about a forest which on satellite imagery didn't exist. But when we went there, the forest didn't exist either, but the people said, no, this is forest. Do you see this tree? This tree only lives in the forest. That's why this is a forest. So our definition of forest had to be revised, realizing that we have been talking, completely miscommunicating when we were saying that you lost your forest. Like, what are you talking about? We have our forest. So, and of course, sacred sites. When sacred sites start to be appearing on the map, I didn't know what to do with this information. But I was trying my best to channel this information into the conservation process in our organization and see what will come out of it. Well, one way how this information was channeled was in 2005, we realized that we need to do a systematic conservation action planning process because we end up with activities which have been not directly connected with the threats. So for example, you saw in the pictures that very popular program was to plant trees, which was wonderful. We had funding, people were happy, people were generating income. The major assumption behind was that, well, you have deforestation, you have to plant trees, and you need tree nurseries. But deforestation doubled during the first 10 years of the Takare project. And when we start looking at the satellite imagery, when we start going through conservation planning process, we realize that, wait a minute, the trees which we are planting, those are for timber, maybe firewood, but the real threat is not firewood, and it wasn't charcoal, and it wasn't timber logging. It was conversion to farmland. So no worries that you can, no wonder that you can plant trees and have a successful maybe community development project, but it didn't result in conservation outcomes because it was not addressing the most important threat. So going through this conservation planning process, of course, very spatially, and we, at that time, were trying to combine some sort of geodesign process of mapping with the people and bringing these community maps and data with the open standards or conservation action planning at that time with the Nature Conservancy and informing this plan, which was done in between 2005 and 2009. So one important strategy which came out of this conservation planning process was that, well, if the problem is conversion of forest to farming, we need a land use plan. We need clear understanding of land tenure. We need clear planning where the agriculture is okay, where the forest is okay. And again, because of our work with communities, it wasn't, here is the map, this is the best GIS analysis where the forest should be located, let's implement it. No, it was a very parallel kind of process with a lot of communication between. And in this case, in this picture, what you see here is the villagers are doing the land use plan, and you can see that the forest reserve is there, marked by the leaves on the ground. What you also can see that there is a map there in the background which kind of informs this dialogue, but it's not around imagery because people felt much more comfortable talking around the land and putting stones and sticks instead of looking at the imagery regarding this issue. However, GIS and data have been informing this process, and then we took that process and georeferenced and put it back into the maps. Another thing which we did is building the capacity of the communities to actually implement these plans, and one of the strategies is not the only one, but one of them is hiring and supporting forest monitors, actually not GGI, but each community hired and supported their own forest monitors, which we trained and provided them with access to mobile technology in order to report on the forest and monitor the forests. So here's one of the land use, so this is one of the land use plan map, the final land use plan around Gombe, which was a result of this kind of science process, but also a result of very detailed interaction with communities over many years. And all this land use planning, even though the conservation action plan was done at the regional scale, each village went through its own processes in order to set up this plan. But because it was guided by one vision, you can see that the Gombe is somehow connected with other forest reserves. So I'm going to tell you three quick stories. What we see now from 2005. I'm going to zoom into Kigali Forest. This is Kigali village in the south. I'm going to talk about Zasha Forest and then Northern Ridge Forest. So this is a Kigali Forest in 2005. Back in 1947 or 68, I forgot now the historical era of photos, all this area was forested. And when I say forest, I mean both Miombo woodlands on a steep slope and riverine forest and evergreen forest. It's more of a mosaic, to be more precise, from the Western science perspective. But it's forest, right? So in 2005, what we see here, we have a community, a fishing community. We can see landslides. We can see a major problem on the streams, erosion, and scattered agriculture fields everywhere. And this is the boundary of the village forest reserve, which communities decided to set up. This is the village forest monitor, which have been using his tablet since 2009 to map and patrol and some of this area with the points which he collected. And this is how this area looks now. This is 2005 and 2014. So you can see that there is quite an increase in the vegetation on the steep slopes, and this is the same season. Just to have a different perspective, again, 2005 and 2014. And this continues in 2017 now. So why? What happened there? Why did this community decided to do this? Well, we went back in February 2018. This is, by the way, Kigali Forest from the hill now in 2018. And we brought satellite imageries again back, but now we have different time intervals. And it was really fascinating to see again local people's perspective, like what happened and why it changed. And I was incredibly touched by, for example, stories by, this is a forest monitor from Kigali, telling us how difficult it was for him to patrol back in 2005 because it was rugged, it was not very hot, lots of sun, no shade, but now he's patrolling easily because he's under the shade of his trees, of his community trees. People immediately realized and recognized the streams and the flash floods reduction and the streams improvement. And you can sense a sense of pride, right, that they actually have been doing that. So then, this woman showed us where her field used to be. And it was inside the forest reserve, and she had to relocate her field now 1 hour farther away. And of course the question was it worth it? Now, every day you have to work an extra hour to reach their field. Was it worth it for you? And she was showing us how the stream, which was eroded a few years ago, basically back in 2005, 2006, a major flash flood happened, and her kids were in the school. And that flash flood almost wiped out the school. And she looked at me and said, you know what, it's better for me to walk extra hour every day and have my children safe. And it was very simple, and it was very clear, and to me it was also very powerful to understand as well why this community in particular decided to conserve this forest. Now, if you go to another community in the Zasha village, and this is a forest, as you can see, surrounded by the deforestation, and I shared this story before as well, but what was interesting to me back in 2003 is that we realized that the reason that forest was still there is because it was surrounded by sacred sites. And this was a tree, a sacred tree. It was another sacred island here where the fishermen were visiting for rituals before they go fishing. So obviously this place was really important because without asking, we had no idea. They basically mapped it on their community map, which appears like here. What is interesting to me that when we did the Conservation Action Plan, because this forest reserve is not connected and doesn't have any chimpanzees, it didn't end up as being one of the priority for conservation. But communities themselves, as part of the village land use planning process, said, no, we want that forest to be a forest reserve, which of course it became a forest reserve. And again, it's interesting to me that even though there is no chimpanzees, I'm sure there is probably more biodiversity there and birds and other species, not to mention the cultural importance. And the last time I checked in 2018, May 21st, digital globe imagery is still, sorry, you cannot see it very well, but it still shows that that forest is there. There is no signs of deforestation, even though outside there is quite a lot of deforestation. So it's again a very interesting example where communities decided to protect this forest, but in this case had a very clear sacred value, which despite of all the challenges and changes and dynamics which happening in those communities like everywhere, they still felt that this is important. Now the final story is the Syringe Forest, and that forest, as you could see from here, Lake Tanganyika is on the left, is in an area which is quite remote, and it's like at the edge between two village lands. And for a while, the communities have been actually in conflict, who control this area or who can use it. And there's a little bit of a tragedy of commons happening right there. But because the area is so remote, we still realize that there's a lot of deforestation happening compared to other two forests, for example. And you can see the landslide still continuing. This is, I think, from 2017. And unfortunately, this is also the place where one of the last remaining populations close to Gombe is located. This couple of points out there shows the location of chimps reported both by the community village forest monitors with their tablets and also by scientists who went there to do the surveys. So we went there last year for 2 months doing detailed surveys with the local communities, with the village forest monitors, recognizing that this is their forest, with the Tanzania National Parks and Tanzania Wildlife Research Institute, but again, guided and under the, with the local communities. And we confirmed that the area is very, very threatened. And there are still continuing going deforestation and tree cutting and landslides. And the challenge is, because this forest is so far away from the communities, people don't have access to it. They are not as connected to the forests which are closer to their communities. They don't realize, even though the water is affected by the watersheds coming from this area, there is not a direct connection to the place. And right now, we are in a similar way how maybe Kigali and the Zashi Forest had. So right now, of course, we're working with all the stakeholders, including local communities, to try to understand how we can adapt and develop some conservation actions which can reflect this remoteness and try to connect the communities to these places a little bit more. Now, you might say that, well, this is wonderful, maybe it's like 3 different stories, but there's so many forest patches. How you can scale up these stories to have some sort of systematic coverage? Well, this is a map which pretty much tells the story, which I just said. You know, it shows Kigali Forest doing very well. It shows that the forest reserve in Zashi is doing very well, and it shows that the area up north is actually doing quite bad. And the colors red, white, the red, yellow, and green they're reflecting 4 different indicators based on conservation action planning procedures. But the data behind it is actually coming from a global data set. And this is part of the NASA project, which Janet and University of Maryland and the Jane Goodall Institute are working together over the last 4 years to harvest this big data for conservation, chimpanzee conservation. And this data is covering the entire Africa, of course. And what makes it actionable is that we're sitting and going through this, again, conservation action planning process in terms of agreeing how to interpret the data. And that dialogue is not a scientifically, or there is not a magic bullet or a science rule how to agree. You have to ask communities, you have to work with districts, with regional governments. You have to agree how to interpret the data. And this is essential in order to make this data actionable. And it can be used not only at the village scale, it can be also used at the entire chimpanzee range. In this case, it shows habitat health by country, so it's a different management unit. It's a country versus a village protected area, village protected area. Of course, the management action is very different in the question, but it's the same data, it's the same principle. So one solution is to have more systematic, standardized ways how we not only develop the data, but how we interpret the data and how we convert these pixels into actionable information for a variety of decision makers, from the communities to district, regional decision makers, to the national, and contributing as well to the global effort. Another perspective came from this paper published by Tomei in 2017, which resonated with me quite a lot, because in that paper she asked the question, what happened to conservation biology in the last 30 years? What happened to our vision, how science and scientists interacting, the conservation biology science interacts with the society and the decision makers? And if you remember, back in 30 years ago, the idea was almost that you have the science and the scientists, and you have the decision makers and society. And as a scientist, you leave your white coat in your lab, you take the bus, you go visit decision makers, you sit there and listen, and you learn what the needs are. Then you go back to your lab, you put your white coat and develop solutions. And then you bring the solutions back to the decision makers, and they look at the solutions and they say, well, we're going to use it. And 30 years later, again, we realize this is not working. It's not working because we're now also learning that human decision-making is not totally driven by objective data and information. We also understand that in order to make a difference the way how science is influencing decision-making, you really have to see science and data as one input into the larger, massy political decision-making process. And only then there is a chance for the decision makers not only to see and rationalize and see the data and information, but feel that they're part of it, they have a stake in it, they use it and the probability to use it. And I think this is very clear in our experience with working with local communities, because it's not about us presenting solutions. It's about us providing and facilitating access to information and tools which supports a dialogue. And if that dialogue and that solutions also include indigenous knowledge, that is making that even more valid. And if that data and information is collected by their own villagers, it makes it even more relevant. And if they, as a community, can look at it on an image and see the difference and discuss about it, makes it even more priceless. So this is really, so to me, recognizing traditional knowledge and local community is not just about that they really care about sacred sites. I think this is the only way how we can address the last mile problem which we have in conservation in order to reach and basically achieve change on the ground by leveraging all these resources and technologies and platforms which are evolving every day. Without this understanding and consideration and engagement of local communities and valuing of traditional knowledge, I don't think we have a chance. At least in places like in Africa where we work and where local communities are the main decision makers for most of the biodiversity. It's not national governments or protected areas. They're in the hands of these communities who have this dynamics. So yeah, when I was sitting with local communities around these maps, you know, on one hand, I was like really excited to see this amazing satellite imagery which was acquired, you know, and see the differences. But I also realized that this imagery are nothing if we didn't do all that work with communities and build industry relationships, if we didn't sit as a scientist with our GIS tools, but sit and became part of the local decision-making process in terms of land use and so on. And it's not easy. It has taken many years, but I don't think there is a shortcut. And yes, we can scale up technology, which is amazing, as I showed. We can scale up tools, but I really encourage you to, I think you're already doing that, I'm preaching to the choir here, to basically get engaged in this messy decision-making processes and stay there as much as you can, because I don't think there is, in my opinion, a silver bullet. And in the case of Kigali, it goes back to leadership. And this is a Kigali chairman who I learned later that he personally visited many of the individual farmers on this, which happened to be in the Untitled Forest Reserve, and had a conversation and a dialogue about what that they need to move and so on. And again, we didn't request that, it was his initiative, but it brings another importance of recognizing local leaders and leadership and supporting it and facilitating them access to, again, technology and tools, but becoming part of those processes. Thank you so much. And looking forward to questions.